Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. We are speaking of Asia tonight, but I begin with headlines here in the United States, and we'll speak of this later in the program. First, the arrests in Boston. I remind myself and everyone again, the first three reports are wrong. What we have right now, just the bare headlines, 3 charged with hindering inquiry into Boston attack. That means post-attack. The suspicion is that there was reason to believe that people knew about the attackers, the Tsarnaev brothers, after the attack and either did not share that information or cooperated with the Tsarnaev brothers in some fashion. That is a headline. 2 of these individuals were here in the United States on student visas, Kazakh citizens. Kazakhstan is an oil and energy-rich part of Central Asia. It is part of the Russian Federation. It is an underpopulated state with lots of money, lots of gas and oil. It abuts and has very good relationships with both China and Russia. It's an energy power, and the pipeline, if and when it exists, will go through Kazakhstan into China. I turn now to China because that's in the news all the time. And Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me. Gordon, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, John.
Kazakhstan has good relations with China, and it's about 100 miles to the Chinese border from Almaty, so it best have good relations. To my knowledge, what Kazakhstan needs in order to trade with China is a pipeline through Xinjiang, East Turkestan.
Absolutely.
And we will speak of East Turkestan, Xinjiang, later in the program because there's trouble there, as usual. What looks to be provocations and attacks on the Uyghurs, the Muslim peoples of East Turkestan. We turn now in another direction to the east of China. This is the East China Sea. And we're joined by Toshi Yoshihara, professor at the U.S. Naval War College, because over these last days and weeks, hard to believe, but the Senkaku Islands, we've very carefully explicated the dispute over the uninhabited Senkaku Islands belonging to Japan over these months, but in these last days there are additional reasons to believe that the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party are going to press the attack on the Senkakus. Toshi, I begin with you because in these days China has declared that the Senkaku Islands are now a core interest to the People's Republic of China. What does that mean? Good evening, Toshi.
Good evening. The Chinese declaration that the Senkakus is a core interest is a significant development because the notion of a core interest would elevate that territorial dispute to a status that's usually only reserved for Chinese territorial claims over Tibet and Taiwan, which China thinks are only internal affairs. China has made this declaration regarding Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. Now they're extending this claim to the Senkakus, which is really upping the political and diplomatic ante.
Well, Toshi, really what this means, a core interest, is that Beijing will not negotiate. Essentially what it means is that there is no compromise, right?
That's right. It means that because China actually considers the Senkakus as part of its sovereign territory, there is no basis for negotiations, and more importantly, it also means that the Chinese are prepared to fight over it.
Fight. Most recently, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mr. Dempsey, General Dempsey, was traveling in China. Is this correct, Gordon? And
right.
while he was there, there were provocative remarks directed at the United States. Chiefly, as I understand, the PLA declared the joint exercises between the Japanese Self-Defense Force and the U.S. to be provocative. Heretofore, at the People's Liberation Army issuing the white paper, they identified the United States as a provocateur in the region, agitating, causing all the trouble. Toshi, is it significant that the Chinese made these announcements while General Dempsey was in country? Was that meant to force multiply the insult?
Well, clearly the Chinese are very good at sending these kinds of diplomatic signals when very important dignitaries are in country. As you recall, a few years ago, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, when he was visiting Beijing, they unveiled the J-20 stealth fighter as if to poke the eye in the U.S. government. So it's not surprising that they're doing the same thing through this type of signaling. But this is, again, a very typical Chinese diplomatic behavior by essentially putting the onus on the other side, saying that, it's America's responsibility to rein in the Japanese because ultimately this is America's problem, and that the Chinese are going to put the responsibility on Washington to resolve the issue rather than the Chinese ratcheting down their pressures.
And while Dempsey was in Beijing, a couple other things happened. So, for instance, there were those 8 Chinese ships that intruded into Japanese waters around the Senkakus. And also, while Dempsey was there, the Chinese troops were in Ladakh in India.
Right.
So essentially what you had was China pushing out on its borders while Dempsey was in the Chinese capital. And essentially what they have done is said, look, America, we're doing all of this. What are you going to do about it?
You mentioned Ladakh. Toshi's just returned from India. Toshi, Ladakh, which is a remote part of India, it's on the Chinese border. As I understand it, a platoon or a PLA incursion, first 10 kilometers and then farther in. At the same time, we have these remarks, these threatening remarks in the East China Sea. So vastly different theaters, the PLA demonstrating aggression in both. Is that significant, Toshi? Would these be coordinated efforts to express aggression to all the neighbors?
Well, I think certainly what the Chinese have managed to do is essentially to pick a fight with virtually every major and small power along its entire periphery. The land dispute with India is significant because this is really the last major land dispute that China has with its neighbors. This is the one that it has not resolved. It's the only one remaining. And I think one of the things that's very significant, I think, about this is that the Chinese are again pulling a very typical tactic that we've seen in Chinese history. That is to escalate a particular problem by engaging in the incursion and then basically saying it's up to the other side to de-escalate. And that's essentially their attitude towards India right now, even though the Indians are pretty much largely on the defensive, finding the Chinese on the other side of the line of control.
And if this weren't bad enough, both Japan and India, today we learned from Filipino fishermen that the Chinese have established a 15-mile no-go zone around Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. Toshi talked about picking on everybody at once. This is exactly what they're doing. And this betrays a lack of strategic thinking on China's part, because I don't know how they believe that they are equal to or better than every other country in the world. This just seems to be so completely folly. I just don't understand what's going on, Toshi.
Well, I was just reading a book by Edward Luttwak about the logic of strategy, and he has a great term for this. He calls it great power autism. In other words, China suffers from a form of strategic autism where it's completely insensitive to external stimuli. It's following its own internal logic that is completely insensitive to how the other players will respond, and assuming essentially that the other players will see exactly the way the Chinese view the world, which is, of course, not the case. And the Chinese don't seem to realize that they're stimulating essentially a series of counter responses in which essentially an informal coalition is gradually emerging all along China's periphery.
Toshi, you remind me in talking about Litvak and a strategy that early in the Second War, after the Japanese the Imperial Navy had scored success after success in the first 6 months, the celebration in Tokyo was tremendous, frantic, and the emperor appeared on a white horse. And at that time, there was a name for what the Japanese were suffering because they did not take into account that the Americans were just getting organized and there was going to be a response. I think there's a Japanese word for it. It's called victory disease, Toshi. And I'm wondering if what you're telling me is that the Chinese are suffering from victory disease. They are cocky and aggressive because they've not had their nose bashed in by someone stronger than they are. Is that possible?
Well, yes, I think that's possible. And I think the historical analogy that's actually worth talking about, it's actually the foreign policy revolution that the British were able to implement with the rise of Imperial Germany. As Imperial Germany was sort of feeling its oats and strutting around on the world stage, Britain very quietly was forming a whole series of new relationships with former enemies like France, with an enemy that it was competing with like Tsarist Russia, and it formed a very, very important alliance with Japan in the Far East. It was all designed essentially to create an international environment that would strengthen Britain's position vis-a-vis Imperial Germany. And I think that's exactly what the United States is quietly doing right now by forming a series of both formal coalitions and informal coalitions with traditional allies like Japan and Australia, but also forming closer ties with the Philippines, Vietnam, and very quietly engaging in strategic talks with the Indians. And I think that what the Chinese are doing is simply reconfirming that the United States needs to strengthen its diplomatic position.
Toshi Yoshihara is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.